Great. Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Nick, and I'm super excited to moderate today's MCLS October special, Building Your Professional Identity Online. As a part of the Mathematical Cognition and Learning Society's trainee series, today's session is all about how we as researchers and educators can thoughtfully craft an online presence that reflects who we are professionally, intellectually, and even personally. So we're joined by three wonderful speakers who each bring a unique perspective on this topic. Dr. David Menendez, he's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And we have Dr. Richard Velasco, who's an assistant professor of mathematics education at the University of Florida, where I currently am. And then Dr. Tomo Nagashima, who's an assistant professor of technology enhanced learning at Saarland University in Germany. So each speaker will share a brief 5 to 10 minute talk about their academic path, how they've approached building a professional online identity, and how that presence has supported collaboration, visibility, and other opportunities. After the talks, we'll move into about a 30-minute Q&A discussion. So I've got some questions prepared, and we'll explore strategies, boundaries, and advice for trainees looking to develop a meaningful online presence of their own. Okay, so with that, we can go ahead and begin. And we're just going to go in alphabetical order by first name. So we'll have Dr. David Menendez have us start us off and can go ahead and share your screen.
Uh, all right, thanks, Nick. So like Nick said, I am David Menendez, he, him pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at UC Santa Cruz. So I put together some slides just to like show you all my path. But yeah, so I'm in Santa Cruz, California now, but a little bit about me is that I grew up in Colombia. So I'm from Medellin, so right around here, if you're not familiar with the map. And then after I finished high school, I moved to the United States where I uh, started a community college. And this is me back in the day in Colombia with my little booties, the most adorable picture of me that I have. But yeah, so I started in Miami-Dade Community College. I got my associate's degree in psychology there. And then I transferred to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was a lifer. So I got my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD in psychology all there, with a minor sort of in quantitative methods. Um, and this is me and my PhD graduation. Family is super important to me. So this is all my siblings and my mom. And then after that, I went to University of Michigan, where I worked as a postdoc for 1 year. And then I started my job at UC Santa Cruz. So that's a little bit about my path. So the topic of today was professional identities online, and Nick gave us this task of like, how do we actually like define this? My kind of snarky remark, as it's like 8 a.m. here in California, is just like being professional online, which might be not the most useful definition, but sort of how I think about it and how I use it is deciding what the digital footprint for my scholarship is going to be. So whether that is what are the accounts that I create for my lab to like engage with families that might participating in my study, what I want school principals to know about me and my research when I like email them, or what do I want other people in the field to like know about me sort of when they start looking for me online. And I also think about it as a less formal way to interact with my professional community. So conferences can be sort of formal and like, a little bit stuffy. So I just think of this as like a different way that I can engage with people in the field or whatever I want. That might be a little bit less formal. I started sort of having a online professional like persona uh, right around the COVID pandemic, a little bit earlier. So this was like in the early days of grad school. So back in the day, it was just like academic Twitter, RIP. Uh, and now like things have like transitioned a little bit, but some good things have come out of sort of being online. So for me, one of the big ones was different Slack groups. So when I was in the job market, there was sort of these groups that emerged just with other people that were in the job market. And this is actually how I found out about my postdoc. It is also how I found out about like different jobs that were happening or where to even like look for jobs. My advisor was great, but things are always changing and where to like find those resources is always sort of up in the air. So these are some of like the current groups that like I'm part of, and like all of these I just found out through sort of being online. Um, I've also had opportunities for collaborations. So, in the early days of the pandemic, I worked on a paper on children's questions about COVID, and then I shared it on Twitter. This one researcher from Turkey saw that paper and contacted me to see if I could share some of the measures that we use because she wanted to attempt to replicate that study. She did, and she like published it independently. But then through that connection, we sort of kept talking, and then we ended up sort of working on a project together on the ways that children ask questions to teachers about COVID, both in the United States and in Turkey. So that was sort of like a really good sort of outcome from that. And then people get to also know about you and about your work. So my current grad student found me through Twitter. I just like made a post about like, hey, like I'm recruiting a grad student, and he somehow saw that, and that's how he decided to apply to my lab. But it's also like a great way to spread the word about a new finding or a new development that you have on your research, and just like another way to like engage with other people in the field. Like I've met a lot of uh, other scholars through being sort of in these online spaces in a way that like I probably wouldn't have otherwise, just because we attend maybe different conferences. Um, yeah. And then it's a good idea if you recruit for your own studies to like have a internet presence for your lab because it helps advertise studies and recruit participants, which is currently what my lab does for all of our studies. And then lastly, Nick wanted me to say a little bit about sort of like practical advice. So, many of us probably like grew up with the internet, but how do we actually like think about having a professional identity online? I always think about engaging in a way that feels genuine to me. Like some people might like do TikToks talking about science or, engage in like different ways. And I just try to like find the ways that like work for me. And it is not always the same. Sometimes it's more, posting and like sort of engaging a lot. And then sometimes like work gets busy and like it takes a backdrop. So just like finding ways that like work for me at the time. And I also try to be really intentional about who I interact with. So throughout different platforms, maybe I want it to be more teachers, or maybe I want it to be more people that talk about science communication, or maybe I want it to be more of other academics. So just trying to be really intentional really helps curate it and like really helps like delineate what I actually want to do in that space. It also I try to make it fun. Like just because it's professional, like doesn't mean that like you cannot be, like I said, a little bit more informal, like a little bit more like sort of like bringing joy to like people around you. Eh, and kind of similar to what I was saying earlier, like it doesn't have to be all the time or all at once. Like it's also important that like if you're treating this as a professional space, to like also have some like delineated boundaries about like when are you going to be doing it, and like when are you going to actually be checking in and things like that. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts on professional identity online. Thank you all.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Great. So we'll save all of our questions for the end. And so up next, we have Dr. Richard Velasco. You can go ahead and share your screen and begin when you're ready. Looks like you're still muted.
Yep. You
Okay.
would think after COVID, everybody would have learned, but I still make that same mistake.
Right. Hey, I do it too. So it's
Um, all right. Can I see a thumbs up from anybody to see if they can see my screen? Okay, great. All right. Well, half a day, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Richard Velasco. I'm currently an assistant professor of math education at the University of Florida. I hope that QR code leads to my faculty webpage. I should have double checked that. I actually don't have a professional website. Actually, I was going to reach out to Nick and kind of ask him how he got his professional website started and everything. It's something that I've been kind of thinking about, and I think pertinent to what we were talking about today about this my online professional identity. But yeah, so I'm really glad to be here and glad to meet some new colleagues. Um, Full disclosure, after listening to David's presentation, I saw that he put a map of where he's from. So I really quickly, in the last 2 minutes, just kind of found my previous slide and then snuck it in here because I've done this before. But I was like, why didn't I put a map this time around? So I should have done that. So I did. So thank you, David, for that. I appreciate that. I felt empowered to do that. So anyways, I am from the beautiful Pacific island of Guam, which is located in Micronesian region of the Pacific Island. You can see here about 3.5 hours by plane east of the Philippines, 3 hours south of Japan. So I grew up in the spirit of half a day. So you heard me say half a day, which is basically the aloha of Guam. And it's something that I live by as I lived there my whole life. I moved to the States 9 years ago and kind of started my journey in academia here. Um, but with that said, before higher academia, I was a middle school math teacher for 9 years. I also taught 3 years of high school mathematics. And when I moved to the States, I was part of a network of presidential awardees. And really, and I was also a national board certified teacher as well in early young adult or youth mathematics. But really, my online professional identity kind of began before higher ed. I was part of a group of STEM teacher leaders across the nation called STEM teacher ambassadors. And what basically we were all part of the presidential awardees. So we were all alumni of that program, but we were kind of recruited to learn how to advocate for STEM education and learn how to actually deal with advocacy. And one of the trainings that we received at the National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C., was actually how to use and leverage our social media platforms. So I never had Twitter before this point, RIP Twitter, as David said. But before then, I only had Facebook. And I didn't even have Instagram, to be honest. It was literally just Facebook, because I was just very much just like, okay, I'll post things about traveling and what I do in my life at that point. But through this experience, I got to learn how Twitter as an advocacy tool could be used really powerfully to kind of extend our work and advocate for STEM specifically. So at this training, we were told how to do hashtags and how to make these little uh, little posts, right, that kind of get the word across and how to tag policymakers and things like that. So it was a really beneficial experience, so much so that it led to my dissertation work at Texas Tech University. So my dissertation was on the ways in which STEM teacher leaders advocate for STEM education. So speaking of, I finished my doctoral program at Texas Tech University in 2020. My first assignment in higher ed was a clinical assistant professorship at the University of Iowa, where I was for 2 years. Then I moved to a non-tenure track role at the University of Oklahoma for 3 years, and I just recently moved to Florida. I don't have a slide for that, but here. So I just moved over this summer, and I'm beginning my fourth year on the tenure track, but first year at University of Florida. So in terms of online presence, so after that point, I extended my reach beyond Twitter. So especially when things start to go south with, who buying Twitter and all of that kind of stuff. Switching over to X, I started to transition over to Blue Sky. It's a little bit more quiet than what I remember X and the professional atmosphere of X to be at Twitter. So I also started to become more active on LinkedIn. I had a LinkedIn as well, but I wasn't so active on that. But to be honest, I am the most active now on LinkedIn professionally in terms of what I do, just because I felt like a lot of people did a double migration from Twitter to Blue Sky and then back to LinkedIn. So I see a lot of my colleagues kind of do that, and I'm very much a jump on the bandwagon type of guy too. And I'm like, okay, if that's where everyone's going, then I'll just go over there too. But I do that mainly for the networking purposes. I found all of these social media opportunities as a great networking space, most especially. Then that's what I really value about being and having this online presence, because yeah, it's one thing to kind of share about things that I do, but I really truly value the relationships that I have established. After being on all of these social media sites across all of my conference experiences, by the way, I'm currently at a conference in State College, Pennsylvania. And literally just this morning, somebody said, "Oh, I think we follow each other on LinkedIn." I'm like, "I'm so sorry." I know I follow people and we follow back. I just don't remember the face, that kind of situation. But anyways, we got to talking about our work. So if anything, that was like, oh, so glad this happened today because I have an anecdote to share for today. So that just speaks to another way that this online presence thing is so important. All right. I do have ResearchGate as well. It's just a way for me to but I'm not so active on it. If I have a publication that comes out, I'm like, okay, I'll put it on ResearchGate, and then I'll have my colleagues and friends and academic friends kind of share it on there. So it's a great way to network and connect, highlight not just my work, but also support other colleagues' work. And again, this advocacy piece, really calling out what really matters to you and what matters to me, I should say, and the work that I'm currently doing. Um, Being online has definitely brought up a lot of opportunities for me, one of which being this opportunity to be part of the STEM Teacher Ambassador program before higher education. But even after higher education, I think being in this academic space, it's really got an opportunity to get your work shown. Uh, Also, in a way, I feel like online presence, you sort of have this informal professional development. Indirectly, right? You get to find out about these opportunities that are being shared only through social media. To be honest, I didn't find out about this opportunity at the University of Florida unless somebody had shared it online about this job position. But it also provided opportunities for fellowships. An example of which is this program that I'm part of. This program is called Emerge. It's Emerging Mathematics Education Researchers of Equity, funded by the National Academy of Education with the Gates Foundation. It's basically a mini grant that we can use to kind of do some work. So I was awarded this grant, but I would not have known about it if it wasn't shared through social media. So I just think that's the power of that. And from there, it's kind of grown for me to be able to share the work that I'm doing, the publications that kind of come out of it. So it's just a great way to do that. And I think David had sort of a similar story to what he had mentioned. Last week, I had been contacted by a current PhD student at Purdue University who is trying to transition or looking for other PhD programs. So she was actually recommended by her advisor to talk to me, to reach out to me. And I'm kind of new to that experience, to be honest, because I didn't want her advisor to feel like I was trying to poach her or anything like that. So I was like, first of all, did you talk to your advisor? Does she know about this? And she was like, actually, yeah, she was the one who told me to reach out to you. I'm like, oh, okay, perfect. Okay, so that they were all clear that it's not just like, trying to steal a PhD student or whatever. But anyways, again, I was so thankful for the opportunity because I'm like, okay, great. This is another anecdote that I can share with the power of social media and the power of your online identity. She told me that her advisor saw a couple of my work on ResearchGate and actually on LinkedIn and said like, hey, this person is doing work on data science, math equity, rehumanizing mathematics, all things that she's interested in, which again, people probably would not have known if I did not have that online presence, right? So some lessons that I've learned though through this opportunity, even though in the midst of all these opportunities, sorry, just checking my time. um, I'm also kind of just like still learning not to like overshare data as well. I've gotten to learn through this importance of being mindful of the data that I'm sharing because it could be really sensitive data about the work. But I think also for my own safety, I think in the political climate that we're in, it's very important, especially if you identify with a marginalized group, that it's very important to be mindful of what you are sharing for security reasons. So I'm grateful to be part of affinity spaces where we can have this sense of community, and 'cause it's scary. It's scary sometimes for me to be like, and I hate that I have to think about should I post this or not? You know, and it's like sometimes I feel empowered to be like, you know what, F it, you know, I'm gonna just post this. Da, 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 da. Sorry, excuse my language, but I'm just, but then I'm just like, no, at the same time too, I have to think practically. I need to be, you know, and I hate that I have to grapple with this, that we have this sort of tension, and probably a lot of you in this room have that experience. That so I try to be careful and try to balance that line. Also trying to be respectful of colleagues that uh, we all kind of know that free speech is under attack at the moment. So that's kind of another reason why. So and then so some advice for trainees. This first one, separate professional from personal. I don't know why I'm giving it because I'm really bad at that. Recently, I'm a lot of my math ed colleagues started to find me on Instagram and I'm like, no, don't add me there. You know, just, but I don't want to be that horrible colleague and be like, oh, why are you not accepting me? But at the same time, too, I feel like I need to set those boundaries and just kind of keep it professional. You know, I mean, I don't know them so well as a friend, like we can be friends as colleagues. But I do have colleague friends and my Instagram is very personal sometimes. But lately I've been like, well, I have some math ed folks here. I guess I can share um, my publication here, but I think at the same time too, I would still kind of keep that separating professional from personal. Absolutely, especially again, I'm a very firm believer if that you are from a marginalized group, that you take the time to celebrate yours and other successes because it's a way for us to flip the script, right? For us to counter this narrative of the dominant form of who should be able to be celebrated. So every time it's an opportunity where it's a way for not just me to celebrate my success, but also to support and celebrate other successes, my colleagues, especially those who are marginalized often. I try my best to update web profiles routinely. I think keeping them up to date really helps with others to kind of find your online presence. Um, and this is sort of new. I found out, like, as going through conferences, I noticed that many colleagues were adding their handles or links to business cards. So that's something that I would kind of suggest as well as a practical advice. And I think that's all that I have. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I thought about inviting you because my PhD advisor had said she was familiar with your work on online via Twitter, I think. So
Okay, cool. Yeah. There you
yeah,
go.
so I think yeah, maybe you and Martha have chatted on Twitter before.
Oh yeah,
Um,
maybe.
yeah. Well, thanks. I appreciate that, and I think you brought up a lot of really excellent points, and I'm excited to weave that into the Q&A at the end. All right, great. So up next we have Dr. Tomo Nagashima. You can go ahead and share your screen and begin.
Yes, um, thanks, Nick, and for having me today, and also thanks everyone for joining. I really loved all the insights given by David and Richard, and I kind of can relate to all of your experiences. So I also wanted to kind of share my personal approaches in terms of online identity. So I'm currently an assistant professor of technology and some enhanced learning in Germany. I'm in the CS department, and my kind of scholarship has been very interdisciplinary. Um, but yes, so my kind of academic journey started, and I'm originally from Japan. I don't have my the map of where I'm from. I'm sorry, but I started my bachelor degree in Tokyo at the International Christian University. This is more like a liberal arts American type of university. And then after bachelor degree in education science, then I spent 2 years as an instructional designer at like a large university in Japan. Then I applied for the grad school, and then I went to Stanford for my master's degree in learning design and technology. This is already a very interdisciplinary degree, and it was a 1-year program. So I thought that I need to learn more, and I started my PhD at CMU. I did a PhD in HCI, but like I was a focus on learning sciences and learning technologies. And right after my PhD, during my PhD, and this is how I connected with Nick, was that my advisor and Martha Alivelli at University of Wisconsin-Madison had a joint grant, and I was working on this project for the entire, I think, PhD. And yes, that's how I also got to kind of know this community of MCLS and work on this math education related projects. And right after my PhD, I started my assistant professorship in the current department at Saarland University in Germany. I also started when I joined the university, the Saarland University. I also got an offer to join the Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center, which is a the very interdisciplinary kind of community of people. Like people are coming from the government, people are coming from like a design background, policymakers, practitioners, to talk about all the things about internet and society. And I've been part of it as like a faculty associate. And this is kind of my channel to promote my work and then try to communicate with practitioners, which is kind of the core part of my my research. And so like my research is very interdisciplinary. I as a HCI researcher, I do like this human-centered design of AI-based learning technology, mostly in mathematics. And as a learning scientist, I design for the meaningful learning, such as self-regulation, metacognition, not just on domain level learning. And also as a cognitive scientist or psychology researcher, I try to understand what are the processes of learning. And a little bit quick about what I do, because I thought that many of you might not know about me, is that so I create these learning technologies, and many of them are in mathematics. Most of them are in algebra. And so for instance, we have this AlgebSpace, which is a free access tool that you can find online, where students can use this real world context to learn different methods that you can use to solve systems of equations. And then there's this one module where the students can train this flexibility in terms of the strategy use, available in both German and in English. And also recently started a new project where we try to combine this large language models and mindfulness in order to kind of support students with math anxiety in algebra. So we have this traditional intelligent tutor, with a step-by-step, the guidance to solve equations. But there is also this free chat window where you can talk with this Maddox, our virtual agent, with the hope that they will kind of use this to relax before solving the equations. We recently did a study in Japan in an international school, which was well received. And I'm looking for someone who might be able to help us in terms of this math anxiety expertise. So if you're interested, please let me know. But more about today's topic. So I kind of started thinking about my online identity when I was a bachelor student. And then because I was kind of studying education and learning technologies, and back then there was no really like community that I could engage with within Japan. And also I was really interested in kind of connecting with people in the US or in Europe. And then I knew that there is a lot of academic like rich conversations happening online. So I kind of used Twitter mainly as a way to connect with these people. And so like early days of my Twitter use was mostly about kind of trying to kind of involve in a lot of discussions happening by like famous people or the senior researchers in the field, and I kind of posted my comments or thoughts, and then I started kind of connecting with people. And then I went to some conferences in Europe and in the US, or sometimes in other parts of Asia, to really connect to then connect with these people whom I had kind of interacted with online or on Twitter. And then so like this kind of helped me know a little bit about what people were doing at the time. And then when I was in the US, I still kept my account and then actively used my Twitter account. But this time I was kind of, focusing on two things. One is to, of course, to keep connecting with researchers in the field, but also more so maybe to connect with practitioners on Twitter. That was really, really effective for me. So this is, on the left is the example that I shared on Twitter, where we created this practitioner-oriented kind of tool where they can create this diagram based on, equation, whatever equation they put in on the left-hand side. And I was kind of, thinking maybe this could be useful, and I shared this, prototype, and then I got a lot of comments. And these kind of, interactions then led to more collaboration. So like I was able to find teachers to work with. I did a lot of classroom experiments, and then remember this was during the COVID, so that really helped me establish these connections. And then I used these connections to do like remote classroom studies back then. This is another example where I share this. Again, this diagram. Here is the variations of all the things that you can do with these tape diagrams. And then, this one teacher used this and then extended, or like, so in a way this, she improved my work. So I really love this kind of interactions that I could have on Twitter without really, having to visit them or without really finding them from school website. And then these teachers on Twitter were already active on this pedagogical resources. They were looking for these resources. So I thought that this is kind of like a perfect match, me looking for people who could use my research. And then there are lots of teachers who are interested in kind of, evidence-based approaches that they could use in a classroom setting. And this, kind of continuous cycle of kind of success on this Twitter platform really helped me, think about how I could establish my identity in the very early phase of my PhD. So I kind of, decided, well, like I really like this way of, working with practitioners, and then now this is my core identity as a researcher. And then, this identity building at the early phase of my PhD, and I also have my website. So like, it's kind of like you're forced to have your own, summary statement of your, who you are. So you have to think about your own identity. And then that really helped me kind of, establish network and also get my current job. So like I was able to demonstrate that I already am connected with, lots of people in Europe. So I could, convince the hiring committee that I could kind of, I can be successful in a new environment in Germany. A little bit more about, some specific things that I do intentionally. So I have this my own website, which has been super useful. I like always recommend, my students, early career researchers. And it's nice to have your own website with links to all the social media that you have, and publications, and then with PDF if possible, and all the resources that you might have, which makes it easy for your audience, whoever your audience is, to understand you. And then like I realized that people actually do visit your website and then do reach out to you from your website, so it's really recommended. And I also have this, project page where I kind of, put all the project and then summary of findings as like research highlights, which are usually better than just, listing your publications, because people would not, like normally people would not read all the publications. They might just, look at some project, and then if they're interested in some of your project, they might contact you. And then you can also put your demo if you have any, piece of technology that you create. Also have a dedicated page for practitioners. In my case, I have this German page for teachers and students, parents who might be interested in, participating in our work or collaborating with us. And because I know that the practitioners also look at my website. And then this is, of course, not, more practical way of, letting them contact via website, but also kind of, a way to show your attitude that you really care about practitioners in your research. And also, I think, many of us are doing this. If you have a lab website, but I also try to make my lab visible. This is not only for the purpose of, increasing the visibility of the lab itself, but also help your own, junior scientists and students make themselves visible online. This is probably, the first kind of, online identity for them, for your junior students. So this, I think, is the last kind of, slide. but some kind of things that really happened because of my, these activities is from the most frequent to least. One thing that I have found really helpful is that you can just, if you have a website, you can just share this URL or QR code on your, poster. If you go to conferences or in your email, you can just link your website so that they can learn more about you. And then, in the conversations when you meet someone at the conference, you can just, share your website, and then you can, just share everything that's on your website. I get a lot of talk requests, and these are coming from researchers whom I didn't really know before, and then they find me on my website. They found some project, and then they found it interesting, and so they contacted me to give a talk at their lab, which has been really helpful to establish new connections. Also, as Richard mentioned, I got a lot of useful job ads, and then this my current job is also I saw it on Twitter, I think. And then, sometimes it's very helpful if you, kind of explicitly announce that you're on the job market, and then people will suddenly, send all the job ads. Joint publications also have happened from Twitter connections. And even I got some awards for my practical work. And then this is something that as I said, I have been kind of, using this online presence as a powerful tool to promote my practical work with teachers. Thank you. I think that's it from me.
All right, awesome. Thank you. I actually remember one of those tweets from 2020 about tape diagrams very specifically, so that's awesome. Well, thank you everyone for sharing that to David, Richard, Tomo. Yeah, that's really all very insightful. And I feel inspired to update my website. So, okay, well, I want to open up the opportunity for any of the participants to ask questions that they have in mind. Otherwise, I do have a list prepared of my own. But if you have a particular question right now, feel free to either type it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask it. Or yeah, I don't think we don't need to raise hands. It's so if you'd like to ask a question, you could just go ahead and unmute. Give a minute here to.
I have a question. I can start.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for your presentations. Those were so good. I think that when you become a faculty member, I think it becomes a little simpler to figure out maybe what to put on your website. You want to have things like who's in your lab and what does your lab do, and how to join your lab, maybe what studies you're running, things like that. But one thing that I've run into is having a personal website, I think as a grad student has become a little difficult because it just seems very bare. And maybe that's because it should be. I don't know. I mean, what I have on mine is essentially just like a little bit of a short bio, and then like a PDF of my CV, and then like a couple links to like my Twitter and my like university page. So any advice about anything that you think a grad student should be including on their website would be helpful.
Yeah, and any of the speakers, feel free to unmute and respond.
I put in the Slack an example of mine. I haven't updated it in a minute, so yeah, don't read into it too much, but it has like an okay example of a 6th-year PhD student balancing like an intro, research, teaching, CV, different things.
Ooh, very nice. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Megan. I was actually going to kind of talk about sharing maybe work that you're currently doing with your PI. So I'm glad that you were able to show yours as an example, because you kind of just did that. Exactly. So I never had the experience of building a professional website in my undergrad, and much less in my professional career here, but I totally understand the need and the advantages that it has to certainly do that. I think it's very important to kind of leverage and share who you are currently working with, even if it's like works in progress, just to kind of, and it's totally understandable if you don't really have this flushed out like CV or anything like that. But I think if you can be visible, and if it's okay with your PI for you to be able to share works that you are currently doing, I think that might be helpful in terms of filling some web pages in. But I also think it's okay to kind of, I think maybe David spoke to this a little bit as well about adding your personality to the web page as well. I think seeing the humanity side of what you're doing as a grad student. So even though you're doing this at so-and-so university, you're also interested in pursuing these sorts of avenues. And I have this expertise and background outside of academia as well. So just something that I kind of wanted to throw in there.
I also think it's fine for things to be a little sparse, particularly if you don't have a lot of things. Like forcing content into it is not going to gonna make it better, right? So think about like what do you want people to like get out of when they visit your website, right? And if what you want them to find out is like what you're currently working on, what you're currently doing, and like maybe hey, like, hey, are they looking for a job soon or something like that? Like, then making that sort of like the center thing might be the most important. And if instead you're sort of looking for more like non-academic positions and like maybe like highlighting different skills that you have or like different like methods that you know might be more important. So just think about like what do you want people to get out of it. But it's fine for things to be condensed.
Yeah, I also agree with both of you, Richard and David, that I think as long as you have all the, the things that you describe on your website, I think you're great already. But, when I was doing my website back in the day, in my master's and PhD, I was thinking more about, who I would like, who do you want, like in my case, I was sharing a lot of like these resources that the teachers can use, and then that was really my motivation to kind of have this website was like, I was hoping that the teachers can find my resources, or even researchers can find it useful, and then extend it in their own different ways. Sometimes explicitly saying that you're looking for a collaborator, or I'm working on this project and then I am looking for someone who could help with this aspect. These kind of things also would help. I also have seen some nice website where you have this news kind of column where you kind of share like, I'm going to this conference, I'm going to work on this project in the next few months and so on, which is kind of like updated information about what you're working on, what you will be doing in the next few months, and if people might reach out to you depending on if they find that you're going to a same conference or so.
Awesome. Okay, great. Looks like we have a question in the chat too. So let's see. Haley says, thank you so much for all the presentations. As a first-year PhD student, I'm wondering how to develop my research identity. Could you share any experiences, suggestions on how to collaborate with advisors or other scholars, but still maintain one's own value? So let's see, how to develop a research identity, and maybe has your online presence shaped that, or do you feel like your research identity has shaped your online presence, like which maybe it's bi-directional. But any thoughts on that?
I can maybe start. This is a great question, by the way. And then, well, I think your advisor most likely wants you to be creative. Like you can just do anything that you want. And then, like for instance, my advisor was not very much kind of active online. He didn't have the Twitter account, for instance. But like I was kind of actively doing it so that I could perhaps expand what we were working on with my advisor in a unique way that I could only kind of do because of my kind of connections with teachers, for instance, and that was actually very effective, and I was able to kind of do this remote studies with lots of schools in different states in the U.S. So I think that first of all, like I think you can experiment new things based on what you're thinking, what you think will be good. And I think also it might be helpful because your advisors might not be very much aware of what you could do online. So you could also have a conversation about like can we like announce this project on the website or so, and then they might like the idea. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question in a good way, but this is my current thought.
I agree with Tomo. I also feel like developing a research identity is something that happens throughout the course of a PhD, or at least it happened to me. Like I wasn't really sure what my research sort of identity was going to be, and then I just followed projects that I thought were interesting, and through that I just kind of like realized like, hey, like all the things that like I find really interesting like are sort of in the same space. So, maybe that's what I should make my big focus. But I think it's also a like useful to like think about the things that you value and how you can incorporate them. So, for example, I design a lot of lessons for kids to learn different biological concepts and sort of have making sure that like people have like really have access to like all those materials, and that is important to me. So like I make like all of those lessons that I develop for the studies like available online, and like some of those have been viewed much more than like any of my research papers are ever going to be read. So try to like incorporate that. So like that could be as short as like a couple minute long like YouTube video, and sometimes it takes a little bit of convincing with collaborators or like advisors to be open to that if that's not something that they typically do, but it might be a way to sort of, you know, get started.
Yeah, so something that I would just add to my colleagues to what they had already said. Yeah, absolutely. I think right now at the beginning part of your PhD, and maybe this is just my take, like I personally don't think it's really necessary to have to focus so much on having this online presence because you're still navigating this journey, right? We're all just like learning how to walk maybe in this journey. And to be quite honest with you, like I really didn't have like a really firm research agenda until postdoctoral, right? So even when I was in Iowa, I was a clinical assistant professor, so I wasn't focused on research. I was more teaching focused. But then I had more time because it was during the pandemic, so I was able to crunch out my dissertation work and get publications. But even then, when I started in Oklahoma, I started doing research agenda that completely pivoted from my dissertation research. And I got this advice from a colleague, which I thought was really great advice. Your PhD research, your program, think of it as like the opening act of like your career. So I think there's this misconception that you have to follow what you did in your dissertation till the day you die, which is kind of sad when you really think about it. So it's totally fine to pivot and to kind of create and co-create and keep creating, perpetually creating your research agenda. It starts to morph, it starts to evolve along the way. And that's how I feel, at least for me, it's sort of evolved. I still do work on STEM teacher leadership, but it's not the main focus. I have like these different spokes of ways. Right now, I'm focusing on data science and how it's integrated in math classrooms. So I'm still kind of like working with math slash STEM teachers, but now there's this focus of like data science and all of that. So.
Awesome. Thanks. Megan, did you have a
Oh, I
question?
just
Yeah.
wanted to sort of actually jump in really quick. I know I'm
Yeah,
not on
yeah,
the
please
panel,
do.
but I think this is helpful from like the end of PhD student perspective. That I think building a website, like you don't need to worry about that. Your first few years, you were not going to have enough stuff. But when you are thinking about approaching the job market, it's actually a really helpful exercise in like taking all the projects that you've done and trying to streamline it to develop like a research statement that has quantity. So like I developed my website. I didn't have any online presence at all, and I'm still like not good at very many other things that we talked about. Um, but not last summer, but the summer before that, I started putting the pieces together so I could start thinking about it. So like the summer between fourth and fifth year, I would consider. You don't have to do it well before then, because then, yeah, you don't have enough to come together. And then I updated it a lot more seriously this year when I knew I was going to be on the job market. Not that I'm assuming people are really looking at my website. If you Google my name, I don't even know if the website comes up. It's not very helpful. I put it on my CV, but who knows? But it's a good exercise for you, personally to, yeah, think about who you are. And as our people on the panel said, it continues to evolve, and that's really awesome to hear. But I did have a question too.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess my other question is how much time do you spend on the online presence stuff? Because I'll go through with the website specifically, I go through phases of like super updating it and like neglecting it for 6 months. But because I haven't been like super on LinkedIn or Twitter before then, like, yeah, how often are you updating these things or checking on them or, yeah, having discourse back and forth with other people? What does that look like? What's your flow?
I think for me, it sort of varies with what I'm trying to do online. So if it's a matter of just casually scrolling through whatever app is on my phone, it's at the convenience of my in my hands. I'm like, oh, I want to share this that my colleague, did. So every now and then I'll put that up. When something like I think like a publication comes out for me, it like finally comes out, I get excited about it, obviously, and it's also like a sense of joy and pride for me. So once that happens, I immediately kind of just like, oh, happy to share, that kind of situation. Um, but I think in terms of like curating my CV or updating my webpage, I kind of do that more on like a maybe monthly basis, I would say. So my CV that's attached to my web profile, I always try to put like updated at this date. And I would say for the past couple of years now, it's been like every other month or something like that along those lines.
Similar. I mean, it depends on how involved some of the things that you're doing are. So, like, I'm just thinking of, even something as simple as like creating a Google Scholar profile that like is going to like update automatically, like can be like super helpful. Very often, like now that I'm a professor, like we've been going through people's work to like decide who like interview and like people want to like really search quickly what your publications are and just like having a Google Scholar profile takes like almost no time and no effort to maintain and can be super useful. And if you're thinking about like posting on social media, you can make your own rules for that. I would at the height of it, I would spend maybe like a couple of hours per week, maybe like maybe like an hour a day, just like looking what people are doing, see if I wanted to post something, if a paper came out, maybe like making a short post about it, or if there's like a conference that I'm going and like making a little image of like everyone in the lab who's going to the conference and like where their posters are and things like that. That doesn't take a ton of time. And then website stuff, I think like Richard said, like, maybe like every other month, a couple of hours, and then in the summer, for example, this past summer, I discovered that the a service that I used to host my website like was not compatible with the code that I had used to like run my website. So then I had to like spend like a week like debugging it because I like to code my own website. And that was like a big time sink. But there are other more accessible ways of doing that that require less time. But upfront investment and then like a big investment when you want to sort of like revamp things. But like otherwise, it's fairly low effort, at least on my end.
Just very quickly, I totally agree with Richard and David, and I don't really have anything to add. But I also try to maintain my website monthly basis. Like every month, I try to update my CV because people do look at my CV. I've noticed, and on social media, I don't really have any rules and so on. But like when things happen, like when as Richard said, like when you got the publications, you want to share that. When you find something interesting that will be useful, you want to share that with other people in your network. So and I mean, you don't have to kind of be forced to think that you have to update your website on a regular basis, because it could take some time at the beginning, especially. But if you make that as kind of like a routine in a relaxing way, you can kind of make it as part of your your work schedule. And then I have been doing it for the past 6-7 years.
Awesome. Okay, that's really helpful and insightful. So I always like to ensure that in these sessions there are some like practical tools that people can bring with them. And so I'd love to just spend maybe a couple, like the last bit of time, if each of you could maybe tell us like I guess maybe Richard, this could actually be useful for you. But if you could tell us about like your workflow, like what platforms do you use to publish your online content? And maybe even if you know about other platforms, like something that would be super accessible for a student who maybe doesn't program, or all the way to the other end of someone who does program. What kinds of tools can you recommend that people use to generate their like identity, professional identity online?
I have Instagram and a Facebook page for my lab, which I use to recruit families and to share with schools whenever they want to like find out more about our work. And that way it's where I also like post more layperson friendly like information about recent publications. I use a Blue Sky for my like own professional to interact with other academics and ResearchGate. I host my website through Netlify and I coded it in R. So if you're good in R, you can do that. There's fairly good templates.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there may be tutorials online on how to implement that too. So awesome. Tomo, what about you? What do you use to host?
For my website, I use WordPress. And you have to kind of invest a lot of time at the beginning because you have to have your server. But after that, it has been so nice. You can customize in a very many different ways. I have to use a little bit of HTML and CSS skills, but it's very simple. But I know that there are some maybe more useful tools like the GitHub I think has some templates for your website and also some CVs, I guess. And then I think Megan, you're using Google Site as well. I think that is I think a very useful and a simple tool. I mean, people don't care like which tool you use. I think as long as you have the content there, that is easy to see. To me, I think, especially for like if you're starting, to have your own website, I think you can just start with anything that you can quickly start with.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, I know. Oh, Richard, what were you going to say? I'll let you
No, I
chime
would.
in.
Well, thank you for
Yeah.
answering my
Yeah.
questions about the fees and everything like that. I was just saying, like, yeah, I just use social media sites. I don't have my own webpage or my own domain or anything like that. If your institution does allow, though, because I just found this out recently through the University of Florida, we have our Educational Technology Center that actually helps to amplify. And granted, this is mainly for faculty, but I wonder if there's a way for you to kind of just double check with your PI if you have something sort of like this at your institution where you have some sort of communications, public relations sort of center that helps amplify your work. So I feel really grateful that we have this at the University of Florida where we can kind of do that. And you might have that in your institution as well. So I just thought I'd say that, like maybe look for that resource.
Yeah, that's a great point that there may be institutional support for developing like an online presence. Yeah, no, that's really excellent. Well, okay, on that note, I think we're all up on time, and I really appreciate everybody's contributions today, and I certainly learned a lot. So, yeah, thanks again, everybody. And we don't have any like announcements at the moment for MCLS, but keep an eye out for our listserv announcements and also announcements on Slack. And yeah, thanks again, everybody. It was great to see you. Great to see you all, and I will see you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Nick.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep. See ya.
And thanks,
Bye-bye.
Nick, for organizing. Bye-bye.
Yeah, of course. Bye-bye.